Thank you very much, and good morning and welcome everybody this morning. Before we start, I would like to say a huge happy birthday to the Ubud Readers and Writers Festival. It's an absolute privilege to be here. And thank you all for coming. I know this is the first session of the day, but I am sure your ears will be warm immediately. You'll be familiar with Bernardine's work, no doubt anyway, but Manifesto or Never Giving Up is a book that just makes you sit up and take notice, so be prepared. Bernardine, I'm going to give her a proper introduction because it's extraordinary. It really, truly is. She's the author of 10 books and numerous writings that span fiction, verse fiction, short fiction, non-fiction, poetry, essays, literary criticism, and a whole lot of theatre, more of that later. Her novel Girl, Woman, Other won the Booker Prize in 2019. She was the first black woman and black British person to win it in its 50-year history. More of that later too. There's now over 60 translations of Bernardine's books in over 40 languages. You think you've got a rough idea of someone's achievements, and then I was on Bernardine's website just to do a bit of homework, and oh my goodness, I really encourage you to go and have a look on there, because the things that you have achieved is really really, and this real thread through all of Bernardine's work of lifting other people up and supporting other writers to come through, which is really, it's just such an admirable, wonderful thing. I always forget to do this. I should introduce myself. My name is Jenny Niven. I'm director of the Edinburgh International Book Festival, and that's another reason that I have such an interest in the development of writers at all stages of their careers, and it's just wonderful to see somebody who pays such good attention to that all the way throughout. Bernardine has received over 76 awards, nominations, fellowships and honours, and in 22 she made the Sky Arts list of Britain's 50 most influential artists of the past 50 years. She's received an MBE in 2009 and an OBE in 2020. She is also president of the Royal Society of Literature. She's the second woman and first writer of colour to hold that position since the RSL was founded in 1820. So you're beginning to get a flavour, I think. So one of the wonderful things about On Never Giving Up is that it gives this beautiful, very detailed and extremely colourful picture of how Bernardine came to achieve all these extraordinary things. So we shall dive in. Bernardine, welcome. I'm just warming you all up too. It's good to get moving in the morning. You make light in the beginning of Manifesto about being an overnight success after 40 years of grafting. Can you tell us how you got started? Where did it all begin? And how typical was your path of somebody who grew up in your circumstances and in your neighbourhood?
So, hello everybody, it's lovely to be at this festival. I arrived yesterday evening, my first time in Bali in Indonesia. So it's very special to be here, and what a beautiful place. Is this sound okay? Yeah, okay. So I was born in a place called Woolwich in southeast London in 1959 to a Nigerian father and a white English mother. And my mother had 8 children in 10 years. She was a school teacher, my father was a welder, and Woolwich at that time was a very white working class area. It was a squaddy town. There were various military places there, and you know, anybody who's familiar with the 60s and 70s, which I think quite a few people here probably are.
Bit of wry laughter there.
You know, in the UK, it was very different to the way the UK that exists today. It was very racist, and you know, racism was legal, as I say in the book, until 1975 or in 1976. So, you know, and the same as sexism was legal. It's quite interesting to look at it like that. So there was I being born a sort of working class child in this very racist and sexist society, growing up in this very white area. And, you know, if you'd have been able to predict my future, it would not have been the career that I've had and the life that I've led. And you probably couldn't have even predicted the kind of way Britain has changed over the decades. So I always, you know, in Manifesto, I go back to my roots to try to understand how I became the person who lives and leads this life today as a writer. And where does it come from? It comes from my parents. My father arrived in Britain 10 years before I was born in 1949 from Nigeria, and it was a really, really hostile environment for him at that time. And he met and married my mother, and her family objected to the wedding. They went hysterical. My mother's mother went absolutely hysterical because, she came from this working class family, and the whole idea of class mobility was that your children would marry up. And so my mother had gone to this grammar school, she went to a teacher's training college, she'd had quite a genteel upbringing, and then she comes home one day in 1954 and says to my grandmother, I'm in love with a black man. And he wasn't a prince. And Nigerians at that time used to say they were princes. And British people would go, oh, you're a prince. It was a joke, right, for them, because British people didn't know any better. You were either a savage or a prince, right? And my dad was a welder, and, so the circumstances of my origins were fraught with anxiety because there was an objection to my mother marrying my father. And then she went and had all these children, right? One after the other, She's
it's a lot of children.
8 children in 10 years.
Yeah.
She
goodness.
loved it, though. My mother always says, when you were little, you were all lovely. It's when you became teenagers.
It's like my husband was looking at our 3 children the other day, and he said, what was it? He said, one dog is a pet, 3 dogs is dogs.
So and we didn't have any money, and but I think that you can trace my creativity back to that upbringing, whereby you didn't feel as if you belonged fully in the society. You were always seen as different, even though I was a British girl. I was, the only culture I knew was British. My father didn't pass on his culture, and yet you are seen as being an outsider and different. So when they looked at me, they didn't see my mother, a white English woman. They saw my father. They saw the color that my father gave me, not the whiteness that was actually 50% of my DNA. So there's always this sense of kind of being on the outside looking in, but I think that's a good position to have as a writer. And then just speeding through, I grew up in the Catholic Church, so there we go. But I credit the Catholic Church. So my mother was a very, very religious Catholic person, and the school I went to, which was literally next door to where I grew up, was a convent. For the first 4 years of my education, we were always late. Literally used to go out one gate into the other, but we were always late. And so I had that sort of Catholic indoctrination. And then I went to church every Sunday for 10 years from the age of, I suppose I was 5. From the age of 5 to 15, church every Sunday, confession every Saturday. Once I'd been confirmed, confessing my sins, which anybody who grew up in the Catholic Church is an ordeal, because what have you got to say when you are, 8, 9, 10, 11? I mean, there's a limit to how many moral crimes you've committed. So you just regurgitate the same thing, I had bad thoughts about my sister, or I stole a sweet. And the priest wasn't listening anyway, right? Because they're bored as anything and drunk. So, but what I got from the Catholic Church was that deep immersion in language, in the poetry of the Bible, of the Catholic service, once it had gone from Latin to English so I could understand what was being said, and the ritual of it. And then the youth theatre was the next stage for me from the age of 12. So then I was involved in drama, performance, creativity, the imagination, and I said to you, all you need to do is press a button and I'll talk, right? You're thinking, I've got some more questions.
Not at all. I'm laughing it up. Absolutely.
And then my father became very left-wing socialist, as did my mother. And I grew up in a very political household where they were committed to creating a more egalitarian society. I think all of those things in the mix, the childhood, the being racialized as other, the Catholic Church, the politics, the theatre, all of that
Yeah, what a rich mix.
fed my creativity and so on.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about the kind of influence of the Catholic Church on language and poetry and rhythm and all that? I think that's really fascinating, and how that kind of shows up in your work later on.
Yeah, because when I started writing, when I was at drama school in 1979, it came out as poetry. And for literally decades, I didn't understand why that was. I would say to people, well, as soon as I started writing, it came out as poetry, as if it just emerged out of nothing. And it was only not that many years ago that I was able to then track it back to my my religious instruction. And the fact was that I had been raised through this Catholic upbringing in poetry. And of course, we know that the Bible is incredibly, uses incredibly heightened, beautiful, poetic language. As were the hymns, as did the priests as they were delivering their sermons. And so instead of it coming from nowhere, that's where it came from.
Right.
But I didn't realize until much, much later. Often people, when they think about their writing, they root it in their literary influences. Like, which writers were they reading when they were younger? But actually, for me, it started at the age of 5. And also, when I went to the Catholic school next door, which was a convent, we had Mass 5 mornings a week, right? So it was a deep immersion in poetic language. And so I start writing for theatre at drama school, and it comes out as poetry.
Yeah. There's something amazing, though, about the leap that you make to where you're quite early on, you fall into is the wrong word, because I'm sure that's not how it was, but this incredible group of extremely creative, prolific women quite early on. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jackie Kay's work. She's with Scotland's Macker. She's an absolutely fabulous poet. And I was astonished to hear in a session that you did this summer that you presented her first play in the 70s, and you were working with artists who went on to win the Turner Prize. And how did you get from what you've just described to being at the centre of such a kind of rich and interesting group of folk?
Yeah, so we definitely didn't feel that we were at the centre of society or the arts society, but we were the centre of each other, So I left drama school in 1982 and co-founded a theatre company called Theatre of Black Women, which was basically to give us employment, because nobody was interested in employing black women in the 1980s, hardly, in theatre. Some of you might be familiar with The Woman King or Wakanda Forever, those huge blockbuster films starring so many incredible black women actors. I mean, we are now talking about over 40 years before, when black women were just not castable. There were exceptions, or there are always exceptions, but basically nobody was interested in giving us parts. And so I had been on this course, and we decided when we left, which was a community theatre arts course, we would form our own theatre company, and we would create theatre about black women. And that included Asian women as well. So that's what I was doing for the greater part of the 80s. And through that, I then met other black women of my generation who had either come as children to the UK, generally speaking, or whose parents had been migrants to the UK, or maybe one parent had been a migrant to the UK from generally the Caribbean and from Africa. And we were all wanting to make a difference, to explore our creativity. And through doing that, we then found each other. So Jackie Kay, I think I probably met Jackie at a Black Women's Conference in the days when we had conferences rather than shouted at each other on Twitter, or as it's now called, X. Yeah. Do you remember conferences when people used to sit down and, you might get into a Barney, but it would be contained and you would grow as a result, whereas now everybody's just shouting. It's just opinions being spouted on social media. I don't think these kinds of conferences even happen much, but that they did then, and that's where you would meet your peers. And Jackie Kay was an aspiring poet at that stage. She'd come down from Glasgow, and we put on her first play, Chiaroscuro, Theatre of Black Women, in 1985. And it was a play about 4 different kinds of black British women. And then Adjoa Ando was also part of that community, and Adjoa then is now playing Lady Danbury in Bridgerton, and she's also in Queen Charlotte. So she's had a 40-year career, like Jackie, she's had a 40-year career, but she broke through in a really big way through Bridgerton. Lubaina Himid won the Turner Prize in 2017. She was also part of that loose community of black women in the arts. She was then putting on black women's exhibitions, and now she's, she broke through with the Turner and is one of the country's leading artists. Sonia Boyce is another visual artist who was part of that community. She represented Britain at the Biennale, the Venice Biennale last year, and won the Golden Lion, which is the top prize for the festival, for the Biennale, which is an incredible achievement. I remember seeing Sonia's early exhibitions. Claudette Johnson is somebody else who's just opened an exhibition at the Courtauld Institute. She was also part of that community, and so on. And just to say, what I find really interesting is that when we began, we were on the margins. Nobody was paying any attention to us. We were like the dirt underneath the feet of the people who are part of the arts, the artistic, creative establishment. But we never gave up, as is the subtitle of the book, and we kept going, and then things started to shift, and suddenly we are in the centre, and I won the Booker Prize. So it's a really interesting thing to observe how we never give up, society shifts, and then 40 years later everything's changed.
That's what I was going to ask you. How far is it that society has moved to where you have been the whole time, how much is that about societal change? And because it's quite extraordinary that number of amazing women that you've just described, that it was 30 years of graft before 40 before things turned around. Can you just...
Yeah, society has changed, and what is interesting is that we haven't compromised.
Right.
If you look at what we produce, the arts and so on, there hasn't been any compromise. So it's not as if we've watered down what we do to make it socially acceptable. It is that the shift has happened from the mainstream, probably also because of what we do, and because some of us have been very activist as well. And I was going to make another point now, and I can't remember what it was. What was it? Society shifting.
We can come back. I've got...
But I'll make a point, but I don't know if it's necessarily answering the question. But it's like... Oh, yeah, well, Black Lives Matter was a sort of defining moment in global culture. The first time and the second iteration when George Floyd was murdered. And that really triggered a lot of self-interrogation with some of the institutions in the UK who for the first time woke up to the fact that they hadn't been inclusive and that they had been discriminatory. And then also the Me Too movement also triggered a degree of self-evaluation, but also resurrected feminism from being a dirty word that people wouldn't admit to being or didn't want to be even, to being something that people were really proud to declare. So I think those two things also made a difference in terms of society shifting. And of course, that's all in the last 10 years that that's happened.
Amazing. You mentioned a minute ago, though, about being kind of on the outside looking in. And it's not at all to sort of diminish any of the kind of oppression and but there is a sense I get, and I think you're quite explicit about it in the book, about sort of liking being on the outside and lobbing in provocation and heckling from the back row. Can you just talk, and I know a lot of writers who do really kind of like to occupy that particular position. How does it feel to be
I feel that I'm an outsider on the inside now, I am, if you're president of the Royal Society of Literature and a university professor and whatever else I'm doing, you can't say that you are a radical outsider. Right. But the spirit of that is still inside all the positions that I occupy, and also my writing. Yeah. If you think about Girl, Woman, Other, it is a radical, experimental, queer, inclusive novel about 12 primarily black women. That is not a distilled version of black feminism. It is it's making a very powerful statement. And so the outsider position that I used to occupy, which was as an activist. So, I've set up various diversity inclusion projects for decades now to try and make the arts world, especially literature, before that theatre, just to make it to give more opportunities to people of colour, because, until very recently, we were kind of excluded other than the sort of tokenistic gestures. And so that I take, as I say, into my position. So the Royal Society of Literature is actually a really progressive organisation. And it was that before I joined. And it's becoming even more like that. So it is bringing in people who would normally never get a look in. Because, you have a 200-year history where the first female president was Marina Warner, just before me. And it took 200 years for that to happen. No people of colour. And not only were they all men, but they went to one of two Oxbridge colleges.
Oh my God.
or Eton. So that's how narrow it was. Now we have these inclusion projects like RSL Open, where we bring in so people become fellows of the Royal Society of Literature. You have to be voted in by the people who are running the organisation, the council, the vice presidents, the president, so on. And, I think they had more people over 100 than under 40 until fairly recently. Right? So now we're bringing in young writers, we're bringing in writers who are from working class backgrounds, disabled, neurodiverse, people of colour, people who live outside of the sort of the capital city, because it was also weighed in favour of people who lived and circulated in the sort of elite literary networks and so on. And slowly, it's becoming this really inclusive organisation. So the radical me is inside the establishment.
Yeah.
I haven't sold out.
Right. It's interesting though that Girl, Woman, Other opens with Amma, like her kind of, a similar sort of dichotomy, isn't it? She's been kind of this radical writer her whole career, and then she's premiered at the National Theatre, and there's this sort of crisis of, what does this mean? Am I still on the outside? Am I still on the inside?
It's kind of prophetic, that really.
Right.
Because
before, I guess.
Because, that book took nearly 6 years to write, and I had no idea that it was going to be my breakthrough book. Right. No idea. I felt that during the writing of it, those movements that I mentioned happened. So then I was thinking, this book is really on the money. When I started it, I was thinking, nobody's interested in black women's stories, black British women's stories in particular. They weren't, right? Obviously, one or two exceptions, but generally speaking, there didn't seem to be an appetite for it in sort of wider society. Then those two movements happened, and I'm writing Girl, Woman, Other, and I'm thinking, this has become a really topical book. Mm-hmm. Surely something has to happen with it. But when I started it, that was not the intention. I didn't expect it to happen.
It's interesting.
And then it kind of spoke to the moment, which was really, really interesting.
Yeah. So I'm just going to check because there's no clock, and I need to make sure that I leave enough time for questions for everybody else. We're all good. I wanted to ask you, there's quite a lot in Manifesto about how unconventional your lifestyle was and how you lived in all these different places, had lots of different relationships. And to me, it maps against the way that you write too, where you're kind of moving between all these different genres and all these different subjects. And how much of an interplay is there between the way that you've lived your life and the way that you've chosen to express yourself?
So, I made unconventional choices for my life in the same way that my parents did. My mother marrying my father was an unconventional choice in the 50s, and then they weren't hippies. By no means was my father a hippie. He was like a really strict disciplinarian, authoritarian father. Right. But I think my mother had a bit of a hippie vibe going on, even though she would never have said that she did. And so that unconventionality was there in my childhood. And then it was a choice. And then I didn't feel that I fully belonged because, as I said, people saw me as different. And then I was into theatre. And, of course, theatre is all about having your unique USP and living in a creative life and being self-expressed as opposed to, I don't know, being an accountant or whatever. And also having an unpredictable life. Actors, for example, have very unpredictable lives. It's like there isn't a clear career path for 99.9% of actors, and they can expect to be out of work, most of them, for most of the time. And so I made decisions as a teenager that I was going to make a virtue of my difference. You know, I used to dress in very eccentric clothes, and I made my own clothes, bright clothes, stood out. So even though I was growing up in this very white suburban area, I stood out even more.
Right.
And liked the fact that I did, because I was making a statement that I didn't belong and that I didn't care because I didn't want to belong. And it's interesting because I think of Boy George. I think you would probably know who Boy George was. You know, he grew up the road from me. I didn't know him, but he also was a very flamboyant dresser.
Right.
And obviously he's a gay man. And I feel that that was part of what he was doing as well. It was like saying, I don't belong, I don't fit in, and therefore I'm going to really become this very flamboyant personality. And then my mother had all these children, so obviously she was very, very busy. I grew up without a bathroom. We didn't have like dishwasher. What was that? Washing machine. What was that? So I saw the drudgery of her life, as well as being a full-time teacher once the youngest went to school. So she was like, you know, in a way trying to juggle both things, a career and also what was expected of a woman who was raised in the 30s and 40s. So I decided I wasn't going to have that life. You know, I wasn't going to have children, because to me, children represented that kind of hard commitment to self-sacrifice. And I wasn't interested in self-sacrifice. And then I knew that I loved the arts initially as an actor, and I was going to go for it. Even though I remember my mother said to me when I told her I wanted to be an actor, I was 14, and she said, oh, you should learn to type. I remember thinking, I had never forgotten that. She was right, of course, right? She was right. I became a writer. I had to learn how to type, you know, my own fashion. So that, and then I was, because I wanted a creative life, I didn't go for, I wasn't successful and rich, as some creative people are, but not many, but some. So I was then having to earn a living through getting work, first of all with a theatre company, finding funding, being paid for our productions, you know, on a sort of, you know, a case-by-case system. So we wouldn't be on a salary for a whole year. You know, we'd get paid if we put on a production, and then if I was acting in it, and so on. And then when I committed to being a writer, which was about 1989, it was also about finding work that would support my creativity. So I would have £10. Would last me from like Thursday to Tuesday, because I was only working 2 days a week. Therefore, I wasn't earning much money. I was living very cheaply, you know, and then having kind of an unconventional relationship history as well. So all of those things were all unconventional. And in Manifesto, I talk about how it did feed my creativity. That's my kind of theory, looking back on it, that actually it was all about doing things differently and staying true to what I wanted to do, and not feeling that I needed to fit myself into any of society's sort of more traditional boxes. Yeah.
It's interesting though, because the way you describe it, I mean, it sounds incredibly sort of free and romantic in a lot of ways, but it's also really difficult, and that you really had to sort of scrape things together. And also there's a couple of one relationship in particular you describe in the book, the mental dominatrix. Is that the shorthand name for this particular woman that you were in a relationship with, a proper kind of coercive control situation? And it sounds extremely difficult, but within that there was something that is sort of really kind of powerful for me in Manifesto that comes through, and the way that you've described it in there is that you didn't want to see yourself as a victim in that situation or any of these situations, and that you preferred to describe yourself as a willing participant in your own oppression, which is a really interesting way of sort of reframing everything so that your agency sort of is at the centre of things. Where does that, I mean, how do you manage to kind of keep that as the central sort of pillar through everything when it gets really difficult?
Yeah, I mean, some people would say that I was brainwashed, you know, and I was. So in my 20s, I had relationships with women, and I ended up with somebody who was like 20 years older than me, who I refer to as TMD. The mental dominatrix, because for 5 years it was what we would call today a coercively controlling relationship where I was crushed. So I had been very independent, very spirited, And then I had just ended up in this relationship where I kind of did lose my agency and allowed this person to control almost every aspect of my life. The other part of my life that I don't talk about in the book is that I've traveled a lot. And she and I traveled across Europe by car several times and spent a lot of time abroad, camping and so various places. So I had she introduced me to the freedom of travel, especially two black women traveling across Europe in a broken down Lada Niva in the 1980s and living in Turkey and living in Spain and going through to Kuwait and stuff. It was all very exciting. But within that relationship, I didn't have the agency that I had. And so that was the price I paid for it. But in that case, I feel that I didn't have children.
Right.
I could have left. Yes, you would say today coercive control, but I could have left that relationship. And I didn't. And for me, anybody who's read my books will see that I tend not to create victims because I don't think that's very useful. I think we have to, even if somebody might be a victim of circumstance, somehow we have to see them rising above it. And there has to be some sense of hope, some sense that they do reclaim something of what they've lost. And so that's how I feel. So my perspective on that relationship is that if I see myself as a victim, then that is the narrative that I've chosen to tell myself. Whereas the reality was, there were good aspects to this relationship. And, especially in the early days, and I learned a lot from it. And I learned never to go back into that again. So the lesson I learned was to never be in that kind of relationship with anybody ever again. And some people are in those relationships for the whole of their lives. They never leave it. They have that kind of relationship with a parent, their parents, and they never get that agency. So I try to see the positive in it, which I think people find a bit surprising. But with the whole of the story that I tell in Manifesto is like my parents, their marriage and my ancestry, which goes back 300 years in Britain, and all the struggles I had as a writer and so on. I try to see it through a positive prism, as opposed to playing into what people often, the appetite for the misery memoir.
Yeah, but you've also really worked really hard at that particular aspect, spent a lot of time looking at kind of personal development and at affirmations and this sort of thing to make it actually a really conscious choice to work at that side of things too, which is something that's not a story that I've heard very often from writers. Can you talk about that?
I know writers don't talk about these things, so I did a lot of personal development work in my 30s, in the 1990s, where I was going on motivational courses, listening to motivational tapes, doing a lot of mind mapping, brainstorming, learning how to have big goals, even a vision, surrounding myself with positive people as much as possible, getting rid of the people who create negative energy in my life, and building a foundation for the person I became. And I had been this strong person, and then I kind of lost my strength for a bit, or lost some of my strength for a bit, and then I reclaimed it, and then I built on it, because I realized that unless you're growing up with a certain kind of background, unless you are growing up in the UK into a certain kind of privileged background, which might be to do with being, 50% of the human race, male. It might be to do with class. It might be to do with economic background. There are certain advantages that people have to do with how they're being raised in Britain. So for example, Boris Johnson, at the age of 4, said he wanted to be world king, apparently. And he did become, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
And probably went to one of the 2 colleges that
and
the RSL...
He went to Eton and Oxford. So I doubt that he probably had to do a lot of personal development to believe that he went to a school that has produced 20 of Britain's prime ministers. So But where some of us, for various reasons, have to do the work in order to become the people that we want to be.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was doing in the 90s, and I continue to do that work today.
So Manifesto has actually been manifest in a really great way.
Yeah.
We're going to run out of time, and I do want to bring in the audience, but just a little bit on the amount of work that you have done to bring up other writers and to extend that ladder down, if you like. Do you feel that that's a sort of, is it a responsibility? Is it, looking at your younger self and wishing that those people were there to bring you up? What kind of motivates you to keep being involved in that sort of development?
It's very easy, really, to bring up other writers, and because when you're in the sort of literature world, you are always meeting other writers, because we do events, we go to festivals and so on, we read each other's books, so it's very easy. And now today, because I have a very big platform, it's even easier, because I can put stuff out on social media and people are really paying attention to what I said. But before I won the Booker Prize, I set up these initiatives like the Complete Works Poetry Mentoring Scheme, which mentored 30 poets over a period of 10 years. They got mentored 2 years each, pairing them with some of Britain's leading poets and so on. And now these 30 poets are doing incredible things. They've won all the prizes, and they've editors, and it is incredible. But this was an idea that I had. I won't even go into the detail of it because it is quite detailed, but it was an idea that I had, and then I initiated a report that the Arts Council produced, which showed that poets of colour in Britain weren't getting published, and then I initiated the mentoring scheme, and then set up a system with Spread the Word Literature Development Agency and somebody called Natalie Teitler, so that they would run that.
Yeah.
So these are ideas that you have, and then you see it come to fruition. It doesn't mean that I spent 2 days of every week working on it. So it's a very easy thing to do. And, to be honest, it's what my father did. He was a local councillor in Greenwich, the borough I grew up in, and he gave over his Saturdays to his surgeries to help the working class people, essentially, of the area with their issues that he would then take to the council and social services and so on. So it's something that's very rooted in my background.
Yeah.
And there are networks that exist, and I'm not being conspiracy theorist or anything about this, but there are networks that exist that will create opportunities for the likes of Rishi Sunak and David Cameron and Boris Johnson without anybody calling it a network.
Yeah.
It's just they're in that system because of their education, because of their background and so on. And so we need to counteract that with our own networks that bring up the people that would otherwise be disadvantaged, discriminated against and overlooked. And that is not a difficult thing to do if there's a will.
Long may it continue. All right, I'm sure there's lots of questions in the audience. There's one already. I believe there should be a mic somewhere. If you just wait 1 second until that appears. Maybe if you'd like to ask your question and I can repeat it so that everybody can hear just well. Oh no, here comes the mic. Just coming down the middle. Could you just pop your hand back up again? Yeah, thank you. Just
So I sense that your mom was almost inadvertently supportive of you. I might be wrong. And I'm curious if you sort of have some takeaways for people who are raising kids about how to nurture an artist, maybe. And then maybe if I'm wrong that your mom didn't influence you that much, was there a teacher or mentor who created a turning point for you that was extremely positive and significant?
So, I teach at Brunel University London, have done since 2011, so I'm working with young people who want to do creative writing all the time. And so I see what they're up against with their families, because often they have to fight to go and study to be a writer, because the families want them to go into, especially quite a lot of these young people are coming from immigrant backgrounds, the families want them to go into a sort of traditional career where there is probably more of a guarantee about what they're going to get out of it. But, if somebody has a creative instinct, if somebody wants to explore their creativity, then I think parents should allow them to do that, right? Because if not, you are crushing their creativity. You are taking it away from them. And there are always practicalities, the practicalities of how your child is going to live, that have to be negotiated. But, essentially, it is their life, not your life. And what I come up against is that parents want their children to do what they want them to do in adulthood. And that seems to me a deeply unfair thing, because the child should be free once they reach a certain age to explore life as they see fit, right? But sometimes people don't get to that stage of freedom because they have been so pressured by the family to go into a career of the family's choosing. And I've seen that in the lives of people around me. And then what happens is there is a deep dissatisfaction in what they're doing, because they don't want to be a lawyer or an accountant or whatever. Or, they want to be an artist, they want to be a writer, they want to be an actor, they want to be this, want to be that. And if these professions are much more precarious, there's a decision I took, and it's a decision that parents need to give their children, especially in certain societies, they need to give their children the freedom to make their own choices. And if that is about making a mistake, then that's a mistake that they make, and they will learn from that themselves. So I think deep down parents know that, but there is this controlling instinct, right, to mold a child in your image. My mother was, obviously I've said she was very unconventional. So, just marrying a black man at that time meant that you were breaking with convention in the UK. And so she was always a quiet rebel against conformity, even though, like I said, she wanted me to learn to type so that I could be a secretary as a fallback to the career in theatre that I wanted. So even she had that in her, because her mother came from this working class, part Irish background, where if you were working class at the turn of the 20th century, your life was difficult, really, really difficult. So social mobility was something that everybody aspired to, because why wouldn't you? My grandmother was born in 1904, I think. Why wouldn't you want to do better than the situation you've grown up in? This is before the National Health Service. It was tough. People were starving, right? So, but my mother came from that. Her mother wanted her to marry a doctor, because that was sort of seen as the symbol of success, to marry a doctor. And how many people here, a child marrying a doctor meant that they were on the way to leading a better life than the life that you're leading, or that the grandparents were leading. And so my mother still, even though she was unconventional, she still had that fear for the child, for me, that I should do something to fall back on. So, yeah.
All right, and there's quite a few. Where's the mic gone? There she is. There's one in the middle, and then towards the back, and then one at the very back.
Thank you for sharing that inspiring journey. You sound very busy now. Where is there space for creativity, and where does your writing fit in your life now?
So I've always juggled, lots of different things. I've always been a writer on tour since 1996, so traveling several times a year. It's been intensified the last 18 months, but that's always been part of my life. I've always had these activist projects that I've created. I've always judged prizes. I used to do a lot of book reviews for 20 years. I don't do that anymore, so that's something that I've dropped. I've been teaching creative writing in universities, outside of universities, for a very long time. So I've always been a juggler, and the writing has always been my priority. And it is, I realize that I need the pressure of having lots to do in order to focus on my writing. And that if you say to me, Bernardine, you have a whole year to write a novel, and you don't have to do anything other than write that book, I would probably wait until the 11th month to do it.
Sounds familiar.
So I think I need that tension to do the work. And even though I have spent basically, since winning the Booker, it's now 4 years talking about myself, right? Even though that's the case, I wrote Manifesto in that time. I wrote a book, little art book for Tate Britain galleries called Feminism, which is looking at the history of women of colour in their collections and in British art. I've written loads of book introductions. I run a series called Black Britain Writing Back for Penguin. I curate a series of books that we bring back from the past, black books, black British books. The earliest book is from 1909. So that's something else that I do. I'm working on an adaptation at the moment, can't tell you any more than that. So the creativity and the career stuff is always there in my life.
There's another one. There was one just at the back, just while the mic is getting there. Can I just sneak in another one? You mentioned that you kind of obliquely refer to a bit of the travel in Manifesto, but you don't look at it directly. And I know you made a lot of trips to, other parts of the world as well that were obviously quite formative. Are we going to see another non-fiction?
When I grew up, we didn't have any money to go on holiday. I didn't go abroad until I went on a day trip to France. Which was a thing in the UK then. You would go on a day trip to Boulogne by ferry. And then with the youth theatre, I went to Norway in 1976, which was incredible. And then when I left school, I went to France for a month. And then certainly from the 80s, I started to travel a lot. And there's so much travel that, and latterly as a writer, so there's so much travel that at some point I would do something with it, but I don't know what.
I would like to read that book, just to vote for that, if anybody's... Right, I've got time for another couple. I don't know where the mic is yet.
Thank you, and apologies for the nerdy question, but I wonder, could you tell us why you chose not to use punctuation in Girl, Woman, Other?
Because my grammar's so bad. Do you know something? Some people, when they read the book online, thought it was an error, that it was a flawed version of the book. And actually, in America, Amazon took the book off. I mean, it's Amazon anyway. They took the book off the website because somebody complained and said the books were flawed. And then my publisher found out, and they had to talk to Amazon to say no, it was deliberate, right? So that's the problem when you have these experimental forms. My background's in poetry, so if you think of, I don't see Girl, Woman, Other as poetry. I call it a fusion fiction. But if you think about poetry, then people do everything with punctuation and often get rid of it altogether. So that was my background, feeling very free to do what I wanted to do. And then with my previous book, Mr. Loverman, some of that book was written in a very similar form to Girl, Woman, Other. So there's two main characters, and one of the characters, her section is written in that form. And I really liked it because I realized that it was very free-flowing to write. When you get rid of punctuation, especially a full stop, there aren't many full stops in Girl, Woman, Other, maybe... There may be like 12 full stops, right? 120,000 words. Lots of commas, though. When you get rid of full stops, the full stop does what it's supposed to do, which is to stop the sentence, and if not the meaning. And when you get rid of it, it just runs on. The lines just run on, especially with the pro-poetic patterning that I have on the page. And I realized it was very freeing to write like that. And then once the reader got into it, freeing for them to read. And the best response I've had to the fusion fiction form is from people who are dyslexic, who say they struggle to read, but they find it very easy to read Girl, Woman, Other because they don't have to worry about the punctuation.
There's one just at the back there. Thank you.
Hello, Bernardine. Hey, Jenny.
Hi.
I'm part of the Momentum program, so we met at Edinburgh. Hello. So my question is actually, you told us about in way that your work kind of in a margin for sometimes, and then the wind changes kind of find you in that margin, right? But in later discussion, you said about having a sense of agencies, and in the context of Indonesian narrations, like a lot of author series, how should we act on ourselves? Like back in Edinburgh, one thing that astonished me is the lack of Indonesian authors or like narrations back then. Should we wait for the wind to change to us, or should we just take up the space and reclaim our place in the world?
I think
That's
that's
a
a
good
rhetorical question, isn't it? You know what the answer is. Society shifted, but we were doing what we were doing. It was, society could have shifted, and my generation of people in the arts who had started in the 1980s, if we had stopped, then there would be nothing for us, But the fact is that we were always making an intervention, always creating art on our own terms, never giving up, and finding community with the people around us, which also is how we sustain ourselves, right? We need to have our communities to fortify us and to validate us and so on, because it's very hard to do it on your own. And it sounds like you are part of a community as well. Indonesian writers at Edinburgh, that's out of here we have the director of the
Let's
Edinburgh,
chat.
who has just started, by the way.
Thank
so
you.
I think that's going to change. But yeah, you always take up space.
All right, I think we've got time for one more. Just here, the fourth row there. Thank you. I think. Yeah.
Hi, just given that 50% of your DNA is Nigerian, and I just wondered if you had any quick reflections on how being that history has been significant.
So my dad didn't pass on his culture to his children at all. He didn't pass on his language. He didn't even tell us about his parents. He didn't know his father, because his father died before he was born. But when I asked him about my grandmother, his mother, he would say she was very nice. And I would say, yes, but what was she like? She was very nice. And then when I went to Nigeria, I was told that people don't like to talk about the dead. And she had died at this stage. So I had no understanding of my Nigerian heritage. So from the age of 19, I decided to find out. And that was when I began to claim an intentionally black identity, as opposed to being biracial, mixed heritage, or what was used to be called half caste. I didn't have a strong black identity, but I began to claim it at the age of 19. And then I did the work, looked into African history, Nigerian culture, eventually went to Nigeria, still go back. Every so often I'll go back to Nigeria, and started to, I became, having been ashamed of my Nigerian heritage as a child, because that is one of the sort of consequences of growing up in a racist society. It's like there was no positive endorsement of blackness in Britain at that time, literally. Maybe with some athletes. If a black person was on the cover of a paper, it was probably because of some crime, mugging or whatever. The sort of society, every aspect of society, top down, down up, there weren't even black politicians then, was deeply racist. And when you grow up in that and you don't have an understanding of an alternative heritage of which you can be proud, because the feeling, the culture in Britain towards Africa and black people was so negative, is that you then internalize the racism. And so I had internalized it. So in order to get rid of that, I educated myself.
All right, folks, I think we have to leave it there. Bernardine, you say in your book that you're addicted to the adventure of storytelling, and I would just like to say that I very much hope that you never give that up. Thank you so much for this morning.
Thank you.